So, our topic today is Charles Handy's classification of culture. Charles Handy is an Irish business management guru. Some people call him a philosopher. And he's also famous because of the idea of the Shamrock organization, which you may remember when we talked about business company structures. Charles Handy is an authority on this topic because he's one of the most prolific writers on culture and how it impacts a business. As you may glean from the quote on your screen, Handy actually calls cultures the soul of the company. And in the discussion that you guys had yesterday, I wrote to at least one of you that a company's culture is kind of like what defines the invisible difference between one company and another. It goes beyond merely how it makes its money, but it talks about what the day to day at the company is like and what its spirit could be defined to be. So today we're going to talk about different types of culture that Handy has classified. It's four main types, and we're going to go into what each of them is and some examples. The first type of culture is what Handy calls a power culture or a spider web culture, which is why you have the spider there. A power culture is basically a culture in which all power is concentrated in one place or in one specific person. And it is important to say that in this kind of culture, what matters is that the power itself, not so much who has the power, but the fact that the power is there. The priority is the decisions that are made at the center. Hence the idea of the spider web. What matters in a spider web is the spider. So whenever there's a problem, the spider will jump, to solve it or on that part of the spider. And if the power isn't there, then not a lot is happening. In these kinds of organization, power tends to be very dominant, so the structure is very vertical. It's a very definite, like who's on top and who basically obeys and goes with whatever the power says. It's of course autocratic leadership style. There's not a lot of collective decision making, and generally the way that you motivate people in this kind of structure is by making the boss happy, and the boss will make you happy with money. So performance-based pay is very much a style that is used in power culture. The best example I can think of a power culture is a consumer bank. If you ever talk to a bank employee, they will tell you that there are very definite ways that you do things, but your goal is a critical thing. To make your branch manager happy. They give you your sales goals, so how many accounts should you open, how many accounts should you service, and you have to meet them whatever in whichever way you can. There are very few actual rules as to how you do that. What matters is that you make the power happy. So if you have to sell to your friends, if you have to get yourself a credit card and then cancel it in order to get to your goal, whatever. What matters is that you meet the goal, and that's it. And also, if you ever go as a client into a bank, you will notice that there are only a few things that the actual bank teller can do. Other than that, you will always have to go to the bank manager. The bank manager will be the one that authorizes a lot of decisions. So they are very much centered on that centralized vertical power. Another type of culture is what we call a role culture, and it's kind of similar but not the same. So let's be very specific about that. In a role culture, people may have similar amounts of power, but that power is divided into very, very clear roles. That means you do this, you don't do that, because this is your role. This is exactly what you are supposed to do. It is often associated with very bureaucratic kind of organizations in which you have a department that does this and a department that does that, and they never work in any ways that are original besides that. Um, the authority is also well delegated, well defined. The rules are very strict as to what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And normally in these kinds of companies, decision making is very slow. Unlike in a bank, for example, where you can make a decision relatively fast because a bank manager is there, in this kind of culture, You will have decisions that have to go to one person, and then they sit on their desk for a little while, and then that person gives them a stamp and a signature, and then goes to the next level of person. So the decisions can take quite a while to take place. And these places don't tolerate risk very well. They don't like for people to make individual decisions. They are actually quite frowned upon. A good example of it is, for example, government agencies. In this case, the one that I have closest encounters with is the Secretary of Education in Mexico, which is very strict about about the things that teachers can and cannot do, about how decisions are made. Um, for example, if we as El Camino want to suspend classes for a specific day, we have to request permission from our zone inspector. The zone inspector, their role is to make that kind of decisions, and schools can really define those things for themselves. They demand evidence for everything that schools do, which is what they call the evidence portfolio. And if a teacher is making decisions on their own, they have to send something that's called an argumented lesson plan. So you have to justify what you are doing, and that has to be approved. So your role is very specific. You teach what's in the book, and if you don't, then it takes a long while to decide anything different. So role cultures have very clear definitions of what people are supposed to do and what they aren't. And government agencies are a good example. Now, there are some companies in which you have very different things that people do, and those things that people do define the culture of the place. These are what Handy calls task cultures. He defines them as kind of like, like a a weaving of different, like a network, a net of different strands, and the strands all collaborate to make the company's missions possible, but each of the strands is a different thread. So the different things that people do is what gives shape to the culture. The teams that do different things, they take on distinctive flavors, and they are given the power to make their own decisions, so that they take their own risks. That means that some teams may be successful, whereas others may not be so much. And this kind of creates a kind of hierarchy, a kind of like reputation based kind of culture. Nonetheless, relationships tend to be horizontal. So that means that, because each team is independent, and they make their own choices, they are seen as equals amongst each other in the organization for the most part. And decision making can often be collaborative, but priority, what matters is that we achieve the job, that we get the job done. A good example that I can think of a task culture would be, for example, a supermarket. In a supermarket, you have different things that are done by different people. You have managers, you have HR departments, marketing departments, cashiers, janitorial staff, and each of them is their own team, and each of them has their own little culture going on. And so, because they do similar things, they develop a similar way of doing them and a similar culture. Cashiers hang out together, they stay late at the place, so they develop their own language and their own sense of humor together, and so they develop their own little social group. Whereas, for example, the people who work at the office, like the marketing departments, might take on their own flavor, to life. And so that clique-ish kind of, arrangement is a feature of task culture. We all have the same goal, which is to sell stuff, but we band into teams, and each team has their own little culture within it. Now, the last type of culture that Handy defines is what's called a person culture. A person culture is basically a culture that is shaped by individuals that are important to the organization. He says that a person culture is a kind of constellation. Specific people and their priorities, talents, and personality are what shapes the organization. So the example that people often give, for example, is doctors and lawyers' offices. In a doctor's office, you have several different doctors that work. They work in the same building, but if you go to one doctor and their team, their secretary and whatnot, they might have a very distinct way of doing things and a very different feel to the style in which they work. And then there are other doctors that are quite different. Um, Another type of a much broader example, a much larger example, would be Apple under Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, as a was said to be a kind of like this titanic personality. He overtook everything that he did, and basically everything was done in a way that would please him. So he was the person that defined that culture. In companies where people have a lot of talent, or where people are expected to put their talent to work, so they are given a very high degree of individual leeway, like a research collaboration kind of company. That could also be an example of a person culture kind of company, where individual researchers will have their own style and they will define the pace and the mood of the company. So today your task is to think about these four culture types that we looked at: power cultures, role cultures, um, personal kind of cultures, and task-based cultures. And you have to talk to somebody that's worked at different companies and maybe compare them. Think about what kind of a culture they were, if they match any of Handy's comparisons, but also think about the characteristics of culture that we looked at in the last lesson. So your slide here defines what the task you're going to do is, and if you have any questions,